Hello and welcome. Today I'm going to be talking about how to create a poster and a talk presentation and what the purpose is behind each of them, um, and kind of how we do it in our research group specifically. So first I'm going to talk about a poster. What you see right now, this is a poster that I created for the NKU celebration in spring of 2020. So one of the important things to remember about posters is what the purpose is in a poster presentation, right? First and foremost, all presentations, a poster and a drawn out talk, are meant to relay information, right? They're supposed to give information about your research to some passerby or some audience that are interested, right? For posters specifically, right, remember that generally the way that a poster session is set up, there's lots of different posters all around you, and you're standing next to your poster. People come up, and then you talk to them about your research, right? So the audience is sort of variable. It depends on where you are. For instance, this poster was made for an audience that consisted of roughly, mostly undergraduate college students that may or may not have STEM experience or be in a STEM discipline, as well as any faculty or anything that came by. So this is supposed to be general, relatively accessible, easy to see. Later, I'll switch over to a different presentation, a different poster that I've made, and I'll show you the differences. You have to remember to tailor it to your audience. So this, like I said, it's a little bit easier to kind of see and read and understand what's going on, because when you're talking to people who might not have a good footing in organic chemistry or even have any chemistry knowledge, it's really good to be able to relate that to whatever it is that they're doing, right? And then finally, remember that you're trying to draw passerby to your poster, right? People are going to be walking past. It's very rare that someone will specifically seek out your poster. So having lots of color, having lots of big pictures that people can see from far away is a good idea generally when you're trying to create something like this, right? So now I want to talk about the specific parts of the poster. So first and foremost, at the very top here, you have the title, the subtitle, and the authors. So the title and subtitle, you want them to be descriptive because you want people who see your title on a program, right? Or who are just walking by and just get a glimpse of your title, they can kind of understand what to expect from your poster. So if you make it as descriptive as possible without putting too much information there, people get a really good idea of what they can expect. For authors, it really depends on how your instructor wants you to do it. For us in the Dr. Ma lab here, generally what we do is the person who actually creates the poster, so this is me, Alex Rosen, underlines their name, and then anyone who had any sort of effort in the poster or work, you list their name as well, and then you put Dr. Ma's name at the end. The rules for how a professor or a PI or whatever might want you to do a poster like this and how to list the authors, you got to kind of follow whatever instructions they might give you, right? So just be aware that that could change from poster to poster. Dr. Ma almost always likes it like this. Next, we have the abstract. So this is not always put on a poster, right? It really depends sort of on how much space you have and if the abstract gives anything extra to the presentation. Um, Almost always when you are submitting a poster, you do have to submit an abstract with your poster so that they can put that on a program, so that people who kind of pull up your poster or looking through can get a rough idea of what you're going to be talking about if they're interested, right? So whatever the rules are for the abstract, sometimes they give you a word limit, sometimes it's a character limit. It really depends on where you're submitting your poster to and where you're going to do your session. Just make sure that you're aware of those rules and that you follow them. So for instance, for this one, the rule was it had to be less than 100 words. So just be aware. So I'm going to switch over to a different poster that I made for a different purpose, right? So this poster, you can see it's a lot more dense. There's a lot more information on it. This was made by me for the ACS 2019 Spring National Conference, right? So you can tell just by looking at it that it's meant more for people in the field. The people who would be coming to the poster session in this area were professionals, other research students in chemistry, people who knew about organic chemistry and wanted to learn about our specific research. So you can see that the information here is a lot more scientific and a lot more in depth. And that's important because that was part of the that was part of that presentation, right? Is for the National American Chemical Society meeting. So people were going to be interested in it, were going to be involved in organic chemistry, right? Or other students that were also researchers that make their own posters, so they know what to look for, right? So the next part I want to talk about over here is the introduction. So the introduction is pretty important to have all the time on a poster. You want to give a little bit of your background. So why is this research important? What is the problem that you're trying to solve? And then I always think it's a really good idea to end your introduction with sort of a brief little blurb about what this poster in particular is addressing. So it's almost like a really small summary of your entire research that you're putting on the poster, but it kind of shows, say you have to walk away from your poster, someone can come up and they can read that and get a rough idea of what you're trying to convey with the poster, right? Next, normally in a paper, right, you would have a methods section. That is usually optional on posters. You can see for this poster, all of our methods really consist of just these reaction schema, but that's really all we did for methods. We didn't put our, like the way that we were doing things, um, which depends on what your subject is. If your subject of your poster is you are trying to develop a novel methodic route for something, right, or a new instrument method or something, then your poster is definitely going to have a huge method section. But just, be aware that that's sort of like part of the content. And if that is something you need to include, you include it. And if not, you just mention it as much as needed, right? So results and discussion. As you can see, results is the meat of a poster, right? All of the 2/3 of this poster is just results. And that's the whole point of a poster presentation, right? It's to sort of convey that you have results and these are what they are in a concise, easy to read format that you can just look through real quick and say, all right, good, 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 good. Why is this one bad? What's different about this, etc., right? The discussion part, you can see there's no section here where there's discussion and a lot of text. Um, the discussion is you, the presenter, right? The whole point of a poster presentation is that you are standing next to it talking about your poster. And so any sort of discussion that needs to happen about your research and about your results, you should be giving to the people that are coming up and asking you about it, right? So that's part of a poster presentation. You are the discussion section. Future work, over here, you can see it's a relatively small section, but it is still important. It's good to show any sort of viewer or audience member that you have a purpose, you have some direction to take this, right? If this is not here, I can almost guarantee that most of the questions you're going to receive are, where are you going to go with this research, right? What's the next step with this? Even if the section is there, people are still going to ask because they want to hear it in your words. So make sure you know if there is future work. If you are presenting sort of like the sum total of research and you're done, then your next step is, I'm going to try and get a paper published, right? Or I'm going to try and apply this to something else or get this applied to a manufacturer or something, right? So there's always something more you can do. So just make sure you have a future work section as well. References for a poster are a little bit funky when you think about them in comparison to papers you might have written or other presentations. You cite the most important selected references, right? Usually the idea with a poster is that the references, because you're doing almost all the work in the poster or you're referencing all the people who are doing the work, you don't have to really reference like the work you're doing. You have to reference anything that you pull into the introduction, right? And if you pull any pictures out of other papers, right, you want to make sure you reference those. If you're presenting a paper like this is based off of a paper that we were trying to publish, you would want to put that publication information in there as well. So the references usually are pretty small and short compared to some other things, but you just want to make sure that your references apply to what's in the poster. And then finally, the last section is acknowledgments. So generally for a poster, this is where you put um, like any grants you've received and any organizations that are giving those grants. So for instance, this was funded by National Science Foundation, and then there were some smaller grants that also we had monies from. And normally, if you don't put, so you can see up in the authors, we have a collaboration here with Dr. Tesson from the University of Texas. If you don't have um, that listed in your authors, you want to put any collaborative groups down in your acknowledgments as well. Maybe even do both. But it's a place for you to acknowledge sort of groups and funding in a poster, right? So now I'm going to flip over to a talk presentation, right? So this is probably more of what you think of. I'll leave it sort of in this view so I can scroll a little easier. This is what you think of probably when you think of a presentation, right? This is my capstone seminar that I did. So it doesn't involve our research specifically, but it is still a sort of a research talk, right? And I created this one so I know it's on it, right? So again, let's talk a little bit about the purpose of a research talk. A research talk, it's a little different than a poster. I mean, the same basic concept is there. You're meant to be relaying information to people. But one thing that's really big, major difference you got to think about is the audience. In a poster presentation, the audience are just people that are walking by. It's rare to see someone seek you out specifically because they want to know about your poster. Whereas in a presentation, in a talk, people are coming and they're sitting down in your talk because they want to know more about this subject. So, you already have hooked people into it. You don't need to have that in there. You don't need to have a hook. Um, Additionally, almost always sort of talks are more to sort of slightly more specific people. So it's less likely to be a random assortment of people. It's more likely to be people who know a little bit about the field, who know a little bit about your research, or who have some grounding that you can be a little bit more scientific without having to break it down too much. And again, this is all sort of something you need to tailor to your audience. So if you're giving a talk at ACS, you can expect people that are going there that are approaching your talk. They're probably doctors and experts in that field. So you don't need to break it down at all. Whereas if you're giving a sort of a presentation at NKU maybe even, you can expect that there's probably a wide mix of people that are going, but you can still kind of be a little bit more in depth than you would be with a poster, right? Finally, the big limit or one of the other big points about a talk is there's usually a time limit. For a poster, you can sort of talk as long as that person is willing to stand there, right? Um, and poster sessions can last multiple hours, so you have tons of time to talk to people about what you need. In a talk, you're generally limited to a very specific time limit. So, for instance, for this seminar, I had 23 minutes plus or minus 2 minutes, and then I had 5 minutes for questions. So that's a big point, is that all the questions are going to be held to the end. So you need to make sure that you practice this. You have to make sure that when you make it, you're keeping the time limit sort of in mind. You have to know yourself. When I start speaking for people, I talk a lot faster than I do when I'm practicing. So I kind of had to work that in to make sure I hit the time, because you don't want to go too under, and you definitely don't want to go over, because then you're probably cutting into somebody else's time, right? So just be aware that that's sort of the one of the really big differences here. As for the parts, right? So most of the parts are the same as a poster, right? So you have a sort of an introduction section, and and the only difference in a presentation, it's not on here because this was a seminar given for people that knew who I was, and it was at my own university, usually there is a personal introduction that you need. Um, you can look up examples of this either in if you're in our group in our research drive, or you can look them up online. Usually you introduce who you are as a person. So you say, I'm Alex Rosen. I just graduated in KU with a bachelor's in chemistry. I'm going to UO to get my PhD. Yada yada. Like, who are you, and what makes you um, sort of the what gives you the ability to talk in front of these people about this subject? And then you also want to rep your institution, right? So generally, when you're doing one of these talks, your institution is sort of paying for you to go. So for us in Dr. Ma's group, NKU actually gives some money to us and helps us get to anywhere we might be presenting, whether it's KAS or if it's ACS, right? So you want to make sure there's a slide in there where you say, I'm from NKU, here's a little bit about our department and about our school, kind of why we're great, things like that. Even if you're from a different school, if you're presenting somewhere that's not from your own like home alma mater, like you need to sort of put in the fact that you're from this other institution and why people should care about that. Because otherwise people are going to question your credibility, right? Your ethos. So that's something that's different. Your introduction in a talk is a lot more in depth, right? Instead of like one paragraph, you can see here I've got multiple slides that are just kind of talking about what it is, and I still end with a section that sort of talks about what the research is going to be talking about, right? So these last couple slides here, 8 to 11, these are all talking about what is actually happening in the research, whereas everything sort of before is the problem and how they got to their current solution, etc., right? So your intro, you kind of need to prove to the audience that you know what you're talking about, because otherwise they're not going to listen to your methods and your results, right? So you got to make sure you address the problem and you talk about why is your solution to the problem a viable one. Okay. Usually for a poster talk, right, it's good to have sort of a methodology section, right? So talking about what instruments you're using, what methods you're using, even if it's just relatively basic, so you can kind of um, talk to people, like you can kind of just say, hey, for Dr. Ma Group, we use microwave irradiation, we use bioassays for characterization, we use NMR. Even just very lightly going over these techniques in a methodology section, that means that when you get down to the results, you can sort of reference the techniques a little bit easier, and you don't have to worry too much about having to like re-explain what those methods are every time. People might still have questions. That's fine. Just be aware that if they do have questions, hopefully you can answer some of those before you have to start, right? Again, the results are a big part, like that's the meat of your presentation. One thing you can do though for a talk is you can have sort of a discussion section, right? So you're still doing the discussion, you're still kind of saying, here's what these results mean, but you can put that stuff up on a slide, right? And that way you don't have to memorize everything. A big thing to remember is that a poster presentation is supposed to be a visual aid for you, in the sense that you're supposed to be able to use this and look at it, and that is supposed to help you give the presentation, but you're not supposed to read off of the slides, right? You're not supposed to read all the text that's on there. You're supposed to make it easy for people that are looking to read and then be describing what's on the screen to them. And then just at the end here, so there's still a future work section, very similar to the one on the poster. There is an acknowledgement section. So one thing that is really important about this is that you still want to mention any funding you got and any groups that helped, just like a poster, but you can also make your acknowledgments a little bit more personal on a talk, right? You have a little bit more time, etc. So mentioning anyone who's helped you, with the presentation. Anybody that you practice the presentation to, they're a good person to put on the acknowledgement slide. Um, and you can always put a little thank you message on here as well for the a little goodbye message to people that are listening. And then references. Now, again, this was a project I had to do for some school, so it is good to put every reference that you use on these slides, right? And make sure that you were referencing everything. You don't always have to reference in text like you would in a paper, but you want to reference everything that you ended up using. Another important note, if you use any pictures that are not from your own paper or whatever, your own work, you want to make sure that you are putting a simplified reference on the slide you use it in. So you can see I used this picture here, and I talked about some of this very specific things, this Eli-Riedel mechanism, and these very specific numbers. Because I was using very specific information from that I got directly out of these papers, I made sure to put the references to those papers on there. This way, when you're giving a presentation, if someone sees one of these numbers and they're questioning it, they're like, why, what the heck is going on here? Why, that doesn't make any sense to me. They can take a picture, or they can go back through your slides later and they can look at these references and find that information. And that just helps to show them that you know what you're talking about, um, and you know exactly what to do. Again, anytime you use a picture from a website or anything, you want to make sure you're referencing that as well, so people can find where that comes from, right? Remember, again, you are going to have some questions that you're going to have to answer, and so having a slide where you can directly address that is good. And then just some general tips as well for creating a talk. Never delete a slide that you finish, right? So down here in the very bottom, 34 through 36 and also 33, these are all slides that I made, but when I went through and practiced, I decided that I probably didn't need these to talk about what the research was in this presentation. But you never want to delete a slide you put effort into. What you do is what I just did here is you move it to the end of the presentation, because potentially, what if somebody in the question section asked me a question about this SAD and wanted to know what it was? Well, what I could do then is I could come down and I could sort of use this slide, and it's already pre-made, right? I don't have to remember things on the spot. So that is a really good tip, is if you make a slide, don't delete it if you end up not having to use it. Just move it to the end and keep it for reference if you need it, right? Um, that's really it. If you have any questions, there's plenty of examples you can find about giving these presentations, about how to make an effective poster. For students in the Dr. Ma lab that are watching this, there are tons of old presentations in the presentation folder. If you need help finding that folder, feel free to ask anybody and they can point it to where it is in the K drive. But you can also just, sort of um, look around online and look for maybe any lectures that have been given or anything like that. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope this was informative.